Recently I was scrolling through Discord, basically looking for which deck I was going to build next. And while thumbing through one of the DarkKnightmon threads, I stumbled across this image. A user named Hinario was talking about how Alphamon actually had synergy with DarkKnightmon, because DarkKnightmon decks tend to play the security Dorumon and DarkKnightmon x-antibody, both of which are valid targets for the Royal Knight to tuck. As someone who loves a good pile, I was immediately inspired to go out and try to build my own spicy take on a DarkKnightmon deck. And the process ended up being so fun that I thought I just kind of had to share it with you guys and hope that maybe it inspires you to start cooking up your own crazy lists as well. Let's call it the recipe for rogue deck success. So in this video, I specifically want to focus on unconventional deck building, or throwing together what players love to call piles. These are decks that typically throw together 2 or more engines or archetypes in order to open up some interesting new lines of play. So unfortunately, if you're here trying to figure out how to optimize your pure Bagra army deck, this maybe isn't the video for you. But if you do have a pile in mind, let's just jump right into the 3 steps I think you need to take to really throw together one that's going to be at least functional. Step 1. You need to understand what your main engine or core deck does really well. Step 2, you need to look for cards and archetypes that have strong synergy with what your main engine or core deck are looking to accomplish. And 3, you need to test. And specifically, you need to establish certain baselines to make sure that your list is actually, well, functional. Now, I think all 3 of those points are pretty straightforward, so let's keep things moving along. Now, in this particular video, I am of course working with the DarkKnightmon archetype, so let's take a moment to look at what the core deck does best. Number 1, board spam. DarkKnightmon can output a ton of bodies, and many of those bodies can float. And thanks to digixros, you can also play a lot of these very threatening Digimon for very cheap. Number 2, filter. DarkKnightmon has access to a lot of search power, but this often comes at the cost of filling up your trash, especially if you search out pieces that are not in archetype. And 3, it does board control. Thanks to de-digivolution, small to medium body deletion, and easy access to blocker, DarkKnightmon decks do a fantastic job of limiting the opponent's options. Now, with that overview of what the DarkKnightmon archetype does well, we can start to look at what cards are going to synergize with it. Alphamon is, of course, an obvious choice, but it's not the only choice out there. Most decks in the Digimon TCG can benefit to some degree from color synergy. You can digivolve pretty freely within all of the major colors, and Bandai has done a good job of giving each color a concrete identity. In the case of DarkKnightmon, we have access to mostly black cards, and while black is one of the colors with the most distinct archetypes, it also has access to plenty of good generic cards to help glue those archetypes together. When looking at packages, top ends, or other engines to run alongside DarkKnightmon, a few obvious contenders come to mind, alongside Alphamon. Diaboromon is actually a good partner for DarkKnightmon because it also likes to spam the board, specifically through token generation, and many of its key pieces benefit from having cards with the same name in play. Many of DarkKnightmon's level 4s treat themselves as multiple card names, so they actually end up playing very nicely with Diaboromon's support. Justimon is actually an interesting choice as well, albeit an unconventional one, because DarkKnightmon loves to have many copies of its crucial black tamers, Nene Amano and the dual tamer Nene and Kiriaha, out in play. It just so happens that Justimon also needs a lot of black tamers in play to really combo off, so it ends up creating a really nice top end that you can use to close out games. And then there's D-Brigade. The DarkKnightmon deck actually relied on D-Brigade when it first came out, taking advantage of Pride Memory Boost, which helps both archetypes spit out bodies and keep up the aggression. You also get access to a very powerful finisher in BT4 Darkdramon, which can close out games with its rush, or give you easy access to a level 7 of your choice. Now, any of these would be an interesting starting point for a deck, and after testing a few of them, I thought they all showed promise. but that image of the Alphamon stack was just burned into my brain, so I wanted to pursue it a bit more. That said, I also didn't want to just copy Hinaria's list, so I ended up taking things even further. Now, how exactly do you take the idea of Alphamon in DarkKnightmon even further? Well, Alphamon tucks targets from the trash. There are plenty of ways to get Ouryuken into the trash, and if you happen to have an Alphamon equipped with Ouryuken, then really you're just one step away from Alphamon Ouryuken. With that concept in mind, this is the first list that I threw together. Now, I won't go into too much detail here because, of course, it's the first draft, and I ended up with a fairly different list after testing. The top end is 4 BT13 Alphamon, 3 BT8 Ouryuken, and 1 Alphamon Ouryuken. I also added in Musia because I hate the idea of Ouryuken getting stuck in hand, so this gives me an option to tuck it when Alphamon swings. Now, sadly, there's not enough x-antibody search power in this particular build to make Ouryuken a reliable finishing play, but I wanted to have access to it at times. And there is some solace in the fact that Alphamon can recycle it with its protection effect, so it's not like I'll never see the card in the course of a game. As for some of the specific choices on the DarkKnightmon side, EX4 DarkKnightmon actually ended up being the preferred partner to BT10 DarkKnightmon. The EX4 Knight grants something blocker when it's played, and since Alphamon stops 10 cost or higher from attacking after it tucks a source, the blocker allows you to shut down any aggression from the lower level, essentially locking your opponent out for a turn. Pride Memory Boost is a must, of course, to spam out bodies and fuel the trash with our x-antibody targets. Now, you still want to spend more time rushing in with DarkKnightmon's pieces, while Alphamon allows you to stabilize against dangerous boards and then close out the game. So really, you still want to focus on that rush approach and see this card in particular as early as possible. I also decided to run BT9 Dorumon because it can trash Ouryumons in hand, it digs a little deeper into the deck, and it kind of helps out with the rookie rushing approach. It also pairs nicely with promo Dorumon and Yuji to help get us a little extra memory and card draw whenever you promote one of the little X-antibodies out. Now, personally, I think this is a really solid starting point, and it certainly allowed me to very quickly identify some issues with the concept once I actually got down to testing. Speaking of which, let's talk about a really good way to take your pile from concept to functioning deck. Once you have your starter build, you need to see if it actually works in the face of opposition. After all, a good idea crumples quickly when punched in the face. But how do you test a rogue deck? Do you just toss it into the meat grinder against a bunch of the current meta decks? Maybe. Or you make sure that it hits certain baselines first, refine the list, and then you take on the top dogs. And this is what I did for DarkKnightmon Ouryuken. I picked 3 decks that embody some common archetypes in the Digimon TCG, and which represent a bare minimum power level for any deck to reach. And then, of course, I tested my idea against them. Now, the 3 archetypes that I was working with are Hyper Offense, Control, and the 1 stack. Hyper Offense is self-explanatory, and in this case, I chose Crossheart. Crossheart was, at least in BT11, a contender for the best deck in the format. And really, it's only fallen off because we just have so many new shiny toys to play with. Crossheart, in its many variants, is still capable of unloading ridiculous amounts of damage in one go, spawning a lot of bodies, and just keeping the pressure up consistently. And if your deck can't handle that level of aggression, then it might be lacking in terms of its defenses. Next, I chose Beelstarmon, which I think is a really good control deck. Without becoming full-on security control, Beelstarmon tests a deck's ability to recover from security bombs and deal with a heavy floodgate count. Really, my thinking here was that if one kill spell out of security makes your entire strategy crumble and loses you the game, then I think you probably need to invest a bit more in stability or recursion. And finally, I chose Raid War Greymon as the 1 stack deck. Wargreymon is at a suitable power level to always be a force in the meta, and a failure to answer its first big push is almost always going to result in defeat, which is pretty typical of these decks that like to hide in raising, play out tamers and memory boosts, and then just come out and body you in one turn. That said, it's not as overwhelming as Alphamon at full power, and it's not necessarily as fast as Melgo was in its prime. But it still represents a game-ending threat, and you need to find a way to either preempt that or survive it and then beat the opponent on the crackback. As far as I was concerned, if DarkKnightmon Ouryuken could not find a way to squeeze a positive win ratio against all three of these decks, then it basically had no business stepping up to the plate and taking on much more terrifying monsters like Shine Greymon or Cross Hunters. And luckily, the testing did bear out. It was rough at first, and I had to make a lot of changes, but after a few rounds, I was satisfied that my pile could comfortably take a set against any of those three decks. So after a bit of testing, the list did evolve. And really, I think it just boiled down to making a couple of optimizations. That and a recognition that, yeah, you don't need to go too far down the rabbit hole all the time. Honestly, the biggest change here was dropping Yuji. Now, I really like the idea of using Yuji to tuck Ouryuken, but thanks to BT9 Dorumon, there are more than enough ways to get the big samurai dragon into the trash. Also, Yuji's memory gain was pretty inconsistent, and there are much better plays to make for like 3 memory than just slamming down a Yuji and getting no immediate value. I also felt like bumping Pride memory boost up to 4 would give me enough trashing power in the early turns of the game, while also setting up my field of Little Black Knights and Fuzzy Dragons, and that definitely bore out. At 4 copies, I see it in almost every opening hand, which means a rookie in the back and then a body on board. Immortal Ruler also felt like a necessary inclusion because I was running out of bodies fairly early into the game, but I didn't want to just add another DarkKnightmon that might not have full materials to digicross from hand. This lets me trash 3 to get Alphamon's targets in place, and then I can spawn a DarkKnightmon, preferably with its full materials. And then there's x-antibody, which is a nice tech to let you climb up to Alphamon in one go. Basically, BT7 Skull Knightmon lets you tuck a Deadly Axemon, in name, under it to warp into DarkKnightmon on the swing. So you tuck this option under it and trigger the effect after you evolve, allowing you to climb 1 stage further into Alphamon. Now personally, I really hate evolving into Alphamon and just passing turn with that big 4 memory evo, so this allows me to be a little bit more proactive. And honestly, even though the play doesn't come up every now and then, it feels so good to do that kind of warp digivolution chain, tuck an Ouryuken, say nope to my opponent's big guy swinging, and then unsuspend at the end of the attack to say, okay, well, if you're not named Black Wargreymon, you're not hitting my stack either. Now, ultimately, I think this list is much more competitive, and I certainly feel that it's a lot more consistent in achieving its end goals. And in particular, I find that it is much easier to set up Alphamon and make a game-winning play with it, and that's kind of the whole point, so it's more than good enough for now. Okay, so, is DarkKnightmon Ouryuken the next big deck? No. It's a fun surprise when you're paired up against meta decks, and it's a list that I think can give other rogue decks a good run for their money, but that's about it. Maybe if a little more synergistic support is released down the road, for example, the upcoming X-antibody protoform, then maybe I think the deck's win percentages will improve a little bit more and make me feel more comfortable with taking it to a win-a-box, for example. It's just not there yet. Now, at the end of the day, I still think the whole experiment was kind of a success because it let me see DarkKnightmon, for example, as a competitively viable engine, and it even let me see Alphamon in a new and interesting light. And of course, it was really good to kind of revisit my deck building process, and hopefully you guys found a nice little tidbit that you can take to your own processes, and as a result, cook up some very spicy lists of your own. Anyway, if you guys enjoyed this slightly different take on a deck building video, then show your support with a thumbs up and a sub if you haven't already. I personally think there's a lot of room to innovate and experiment in the TCG YouTuber space, but of course, your feedback is crucial so that I know what you guys like, what you guys don't like, and where there is room to kind of experiment and just make the space a little more interesting for all of us. But anyway, I will catch you guys all in the next one, and until then, take it easy.